Look, Tory Lanez has a new album, and the circumstances around this new record are raising some questions. Tory is in prison serving a 10-year sentence for shooting Megan Thee Stallion. He recorded this album from prison. The group chat's here. They've got thoughts. Let's get into it. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Okay, look, this new Tory Lanez album is called Peterson. That is Tory's real last name. It's a sort of sequel to Daystar, which came out in 2020. That's his real first name. The reason this album is being talked about at all is that right now, the Canadian rapper is serving a 10-year prison sentence for the 2020 shooting of Megan Thee Stallion. The album's release has raised some interesting moral questions, like, is it okay for someone serving prison time to record music from prison and then release it commercially? Matt Amha is here, and Pablo the Don is here, and we're ready to talk about this. Matt, Pablo, welcome to the show, y'all.
Hey.
Hello. Nice to see you. Listen, Pablo, before we get into the politics around Tory's new record and this idea of him recording this album from prison, how are you feeling about the album itself that you heard?
I mean, I think there's two things about this album that intrigued me. Number one was it's him basically begging for his freedom any way possible, whether it's trying to get his fans or maybe even critics on his side, to asking Donald Trump to please come save him by using AI voice of him to basically try and say he's innocent of what he's done or been convicted of. I find it interesting. I do think there's a big moral, but also a big just how did he do this question, because it sounds so professionally done. But in general, I think Tory is just begging for his freedom.
I'm going to get back to the how in just a moment. And Matt, let me just ask you just reaction in terms of the record that you heard. What about you? How are you feeling about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in a lot of ways, the album is essentially a male grievance manifesto. I think, this is him, and like he's managed to do a really interesting thing, which is basically frame himself as like a Black political prisoner, as a victim of a witch hunt, as a martyr of some kind, and like LARPing as a freedom fighter throughout the entire body of work. There's no mention of the fact that he's in prison, not for challenging a system or engaging in some kind of revolutionary act, but for literally shooting a defenseless Black woman in public, right? Like, so I think, but then also to the point that Pablo just made, like, I think that he is working up a popular movement that he hopes will eventually land on the desk of the US president. Exactly what has just been said. He literally features Donald Trump. Trump is someone that is known to be vulnerable to flattery, but also to men with power and to hypermasculinity. Trump has also been known to issue pardons for others in hip hop, like Kodak Black and the founder of Death Row Records. So this is for sure Tory angling for a pardon of some kind, yeah, for sure.
I can think of no more unflattering words than a male grievance manifesto. That is like, just that phrase. I'm like, okay, I'm out, just in terms of just on in that phrasing. So Tory is calling this album an album that's recorded in prison for prisoners by prisoners in real time. I think that's what you're referring to, Matt, when you say he's LARPing as a freedom fighter. Matt, you wanted to talk about Guide Me Through the Storm. Let's just hear a little bit of that song.
That it was not just about you, but also about the others, the many other incarcerated sisters and brothers. That's when I gave you to God, knowing that he would keep you covered. And in the realm of the spirit, that's where I hovered, like an eagle in flight, a samurai prayer warrior against the witches and warlocks, pulling down strongholds of witchcraft, divination, necromancy.
Matt, it's not going to be any news to anybody that the carceral justice system has been deeply, deeply racist for a long time in America. That's a narrative that is out there. Tory Lanez is weaving that narrative throughout this album. Why is that the song that you wanted to pick?
Yeah, I mean, if you were to hear that out of context, you'd think that was a sermon dedicated to a revolutionary of some kind, right? Like it's pretty incredible. But that's an interlude by his father, in which his dad is kind of eulogizing him in some ways, canonizing him and venerating his child, who he believes, as you've said, to be victim of an unjust system. He goes on in that same sermon to literally connect the imprisonment of Tory Lanez to the sale of African slaves on the New York Stock Exchange, right? Like framing the incarceration of his child as a continuation of the historical persecution of Black people. Again, this is a man in prison for shooting a defenseless Black woman, right? So there's a certain incoherency that can be really difficult to listen to. And like, I think also, it's also just deeply sad. Like, this is especially that little passage in particular, like this is a pious black man essentially mourning the loss of his child and trying to come terms with the fact that his son is responsible for a heinous act of violence. And he can't seem to make sense of it, you know? And when we can't make sense of things, we tend to turn to delusion, and that's exactly what that is. And so as like a human being and as a black man, I hear that, and it registers to me as pain, despite the fact he happens to be the father of a man that did a terrible thing.
Yeah, I don't think delusion is a small word, and I think you're using that very very deliberately and very intentionally here. Pablo, what's the cut that stood out for you?
He's got a song called "Free Me," and there's this spiritual element throughout the entire album, but specifically on this song that just like really irks my soul.
Okay,
truthfully.
Let's just hear a little bit of "Free Me."
Crying in the cell so many nights that I felt trapped in. Had to pray to God and ask the Lord if he could free me. I got a son, I got some family that need me. Plus I got a stun on soldier if that try to cheat me. Prison isn't easy.
Pablo, tell me about this song. Why does it irk you? Why is it landing with you in that way?
It is I feel as though the classic black man goes to jail. This is what they pull on, this connection to God. Suddenly they found God. They're in all the prison sermon sessions, things like that. And suddenly like they found Jesus, they found the light, and now they need to be freed because, you know, they're going to come out and live a better life and they're going to live in accordance to Jesus. It almost never happens. There are some people who have truly found God in jail and prison, but Tory Lanez, based on the rest of this album, is not one of them. And it just bothers me when we're bringing in these elements because, as Matt said, you're tying yourself not only to like these political revolutionaries, but now you're tying yourself to God, finding any way. It feels like he's punching air, just trying to find anything to grasp onto in order to get people to rally behind him to potentially start something that would end in his pardon for, again, shooting a defenseless black woman.
And also, if I could just say real quick, like this is him appealing to black people's sensibility for God. This is him appealing to the president of the United States' sensibility for masculinity and for power. And this is him playing into the black tradition of, you know, revolutionary action. Like he is grasping at anything to try to appeal his case to people that he think may be licensed to care, you know, which is really cynical.
You know, what I'm struck by is that like these are narratives that have existed for a long time. And it would make sense for someone in prison to sort of like try to hook onto them to try to tell the story. But both of you seem to be reacting to the very cynical transparency of how this appears, not as some kind of sort of genuine posture, but as entirely something that is like sort of put on. Matt, when you think about this sort of cynical transparency of it, like what do you think you're reacting to? That is like, this has never been who Tory Lanez is. Why is it, you know, Tory now?
Because Tory is mapping himself onto something that has genuinely existed in hip hop, right? I mean, and there's like really complicated undertones to this as well, you know. Like again, I've talked about Tupac Shakur on the show in relation to Kendrick Lamar, but it's also the case, and you know, the first voice we hear on this album, one of the first voices is Tupac Shakur's, right? So he is also quite literally mapping himself onto Pac. And it's also the case that Tupac Shakur also went to jail for a violation against a woman. You know, it's a really difficult truth, but it happens to be the case. And so what we're responding to is the fact that he is so cynically and so brazenly borrowing from things that we understand to be true and pretending that it's honesty, you know, and he's reselling it to the public as honesty. And it's, you know, it's a tactic of manipulation. I think it would be much more powerful for him to kind of repent and, you know, admit to his faults and, you know, make an album about trying to become a better person. And rather he's trying to manipulate the consumer into getting him out of jail, frankly.
Pablo, I'll get to you in just a moment, but I do want to go back to something that was mentioned earlier about this idea of like, how does an album like this sound so professionally made? Again, Tory is currently serving time for the 2020 shooting of Megan Thee Stallion. He reportedly recorded the vocals for this album in prison. It's not the first time he has recorded music while incarcerated and put it out. Wayne has done this. Gucci Mane has done this. Thug has done this. Maybe, R. Kelly has done this. Matt, just practically speaking, my question is how? How are they able to pull off something like this?
I mean, the honest answer is with the great participation of people in prison. And, you know, with the help of guards, with the help of their fellow inmates, they're typically recording these things on jail phones. And I think, or they have historically, but they've not necessarily sounded as great as a result. But I think, you know, with the advent of AI and new emerging tech, you have much of the same quality control of a traditional studio. And, you know, whilst being incarcerated. And so I think this album from Tory is probably the great example of that. you know? But yeah, he's playing into this much broader tradition of the jail album and the jail record, which have really always been an institution in hip hop,
Right.
like, and you've kind of named some of the people that have done that. But yeah, and so the whole thing is so cynical because this is a storied tradition. This is something that like hip hop is inherently a street culture, even though it has been subject to this cultural theft and it's been corporatized. Rap comes from the street. Rap is inherently oppositional to the police and to prisons. And so the consumer, the listener, has an inherent soft spot for records made in prison, and he's playing into that and falsely positioning himself within this tradition.
We should say, like, within that context, Pablo, there are so many programs that allow inmates to make music while incarcerated, but those are not necessarily targeted, to inmates that are also high-profile musicians. Like, that's not the way that is supposed to work, right?
No, usually these are programs for people that are in prison for cathartic release. Nothing about this record for Tory is cathartic. He's been saying this since before he even went to prison, that he's innocent and free him, even though he wasn't even in jail yet. He was saying free him. So I think that's him kind of telling on himself. But those programs are meant for normal people looking for cathartic relief, and probably people who are honestly either actually innocent, professing their innocence, or people who are guilty coming to terms with what they've done. Not for a megastar looking to commercialize and make money off of cosplaying political revolutionaries, cosplaying people who actually do go to church and have a connection to a higher power, cosplaying someone who's actually innocent. That's not what those programs are for. And he's just taking advantage of this.
It's not lost on me, Matt, that some of the reporting around this is that Tory Lanez has had his recording equipment confiscated by authorities in the last year or so. But also, this is an album that is coming out like a few months after we had Sing Sing, and I know, like, you produced the interview, Matt, about Sing Sing, about a movie that is about a theater program in a prison that is like about giving the inmates that exact thing, that exact sort of catharsis, and be able to just reconnect with your own humanity again. So when you think about the difference between that experience and an experience of an established artist serving time for a crime that he was convicted for, releasing music and trying to benefit from it commercially, how far apart are those two different worlds?
Well, I think the world of Sing Sing is inherently different in that with Tory, the world saw him commit the crime that he's now in prison for, right? And the space that we're willing to give to artists that are creating art while in prison largely has to do with whether or not we're able to render them as innocent, or whether or not we're able to see them as redeemable. And in the eyes of much of the public, by virtue of his crime, Tory is not redeemable, right? And Tory is not innocent because we've all seen it. Yeah. And so there's a lot of conversations that can be had around like freedom to speech, and like the constitutional rights that American citizens should have, and about the 13th Amendment. I think what I find more interesting is like talking about what is kind of an inherent part of prison life. And, it just so happens to be the case, like prisons are microcosms of life. Money and celebrity can and will be wielded in prison very much in the same fashion that they are in the street, to privilege the few and to disenfranchise the many. And so famous and moneyed artists will continue to go to prison and will continue to find guards and staff willing to sneak in phones and equipment, and happy to kind of participate in the recording of music. This is a fact of life. Like, Lil Wayne, he talked about when he was making music on Rikers Island, one of the most notorious prison colonies in the United States. Yeah. He would have guards that were happy to coordinate his recording sessions with him because they wanted also to contribute to the work of a platinum selling artist, So this is just a thing that's going to continue to happen. Whether or not we're comfortable with it or not, I think largely people's discomfort has to do with the nature of Tory's crime, not necessarily the fact that he is a person in jail,
Right. Pablo, last word to you here. Should someone like Tory Lanez be allowed to record music in prison that is specifically intended for commercial release, that is going to go towards, raising his profile more, maybe funding that campaign to get his case all the way to Donald Trump? Like, should he be allowed to do something like this, you think?
I think, truthfully, he should be living life as all other prisoners. But unfortunately, as Matt said, because of his access to fame, because of his access to wealth, that's just not a reality. And so for that case, it comes down to the people who are listening, the people who are streaming, whether or not they're going to support this. I bet if no one streams that album, Tory Lanez probably will still make music, but it will be just like every other prisoner that's in prison. It will go nowhere. It will just be in the ether. So truthfully, I'm not a fan of it, but I understand it is in some way just part of of who he is and how he's able to wield and deal in there. And it is an unfortunate part of what is going on.
This feels like the moment to note that this is the only conversation I've ever had about a Tory Lanez album. It's not like he was, a significant artist on the radar before then. Maybe he was going to become one at a certain point. That is certainly, that ship has sailed. I appreciate both of your time. I appreciate you guys being here and for your insight. Thanks again so much.
Thanks for having
us.
Yes, of course. Matt Amha is a writer and culture critic from Toronto. Pablo the Don is a culture critic and part of Those Wrestling Girls podcast there in Springfield, Massachusetts. All right, for the folks watching us on YouTube, by the way, we got to say goodbye for now, but Commotion will be back tomorrow. But the rest of you on podcast, on radio, stick around. You're going to hear all about this new installment of Civilization 7.